Good afternoon and welcome to the kitchen at the Defiance Ruston Senior Center. I'm Hal Meng. Maybe you've seen some of the other videos that we've done. But I teach chair yoga classes here, and I also work with an organization that I started, the Center for Food Preservation Arts. And the goal of the Center for Food Preservation Arts is to continue to keep alive the whole camaraderie of canning together and also providing for food banks and feeding ministries. So we started filming about the middle of April, about once a week, and now we're looking at continuing this even after the center opens. Last time we demonstrated how to make jam and jellies using some things that you may not have seen before, like Pomonas Pectin. So that video is still up on both Center for Food Preservation Arts website and also on the Defiance Ruston Senior Center Facebook page. Well, here we are in early May, and in just a few weeks, local farmers will begin producing and putting on market berries and other fresh fruit. I strongly encourage everyone to try and support your local farmers as much as possible, because they have been hurt as much as any other of the small local businesses. And we've seen that the further that any food has to travel, the more insecure the food chain is. Well, today we're going to take a look at what makes it possible for you to make jams, jellies, salsas all year round. Not everything ripens at the same time. So the only way to really be able to make something like my favorite blackberry, rhubarb, lime is to have things frozen. In the spring, when the rhubarb is out, I can gather that, chop it up, freeze it, have it on hand. In the fall, blackberries and limes whenever they go on sale. Frozen foods retain their vitamins, minerals, their carbohydrates, proteins, and fats for at least 2 years if they're properly frozen. And many may have more vitamins and minerals in them compared to fresh, because enzyme action breaks down those vitamins and minerals over time. So we'll be looking at the basics of freezing fruits and vegetables. The process is pretty much the same whether you're freezing a couple of pounds or a couple 100 pounds, like we've done for the Preserving for the Hungry program. At the end, we'll post some links to articles that go into more depth on all of these techniques, but we're going to start by hitting on some of the main points. You always want to begin by selecting fruit just at its peak of ripeness, or in some fruits, just before they're completely ripe. Now, as soon as a fruit or vegetable is picked, it immediately starts to lose some of its nutritional value. So the faster you can get it frozen, the better. You want to clean the fruit or vegetables to remove pesticides. Hopefully you can find some that are grown without overdosing with pesticides. And you also want to inhibit bacteria. So one of the traditional ways to do that is to soak firm-skinned fruits and vegetables like apples or vegetables like beans in a solution of vinegar and water for about 20 minutes. This does not work really well with berries. Those can be just rinsed in that solution. There are some folks that say that soaking it in baking soda solution instead of with vinegar removes more pesticides, but that's personal choice, and there's lots of information out there. All fruits and vegetables continue to have that enzyme action and start losing their color and flavor and nutritional value, and the amount of time it would take to freeze them, that's going to continue on unless you do something called pre-treating. Now, with fruits and vegetables, we pre-treat with an acid solution like lemon juice or a solution of ascorbic acid. Vegetables are blanched, and there's plenty of other information out there on other sites because each vegetable, there's usually a suggestion of a different amount of time for it. Now, the kind of container that you're going to freeze it in depends entirely on what your ultimate use is. For example, if you were going to use them as individual beans or berries, you're going to want to freeze them on a flat tray. One thing that you need to bear in mind is frozen fruit or vegetables are basically still raw, which means that they need to be treated carefully so that when you're defrosting, you want to defrost them in a refrigerator if possible. You want to try and store them after they're defrosted at 40 degrees or less. And if you have them sitting out like on a fruit plate or something like that, you want to use them after they've been out of that 40 degrees at least within 2 hours. So freezing on a flat tray and then packaging allows you to keep the fruit or vegetables as individual pieces. And it's one of my favorite ways of doing it. Now, the type of container you use can be plastic freezer containers like from Ball or others, or they can even be glass jars. But a little note about glass jars. For a long time, everyone thought you could just freeze anything you wanted in them. But it turns out that if you're using canning jars and you want to use them again for canning as opposed to freezing, that taking them down in the freezer like that can cause them to become weakened. So if you can them, they may break, unless they're the newer ones that clearly say on the box, ideal for canning and freezing. Another convenient way of storing in the freezer are in freezer bags, Ziploc freezer bags, or ideally using some of the home vacuum packers. Because if you can seal out the air and sunlight and keep it at 0 or lower, the Department of Agriculture says that the nutritional value, although they recommend using everything within 2 years, the values of the nutritional value would still be good as much as 25 years later. One of the interesting things that you can do that we don't often think about is to freeze fresh herbs for later use. Now, herbs are quite sensitive, and so if you just put them in a freezer, just like you may have seen in your garden, they will brown very quickly, and that includes any part of the herb that is exposed to the air. So one of the things that's a nice way to freeze the herbs is to cut them into small pieces, put them in an ice cube tray, and pour some water over. Now they're going to float to the top, so you only fill them part way and freeze it, and then you take it out and pour some more water over the top, and that will help you hold the herbs, the color, and the texture a little bit better. Another thing that people don't think about freezing are mushrooms. Now, mushrooms are filled with a great deal of water, just like eggplant, and they don't freeze very well because they turn into a kind of a mush unless you treat them carefully, which in this case would be to saute the eggplant or the mushrooms in a nice oil or butter. That draws the water out, and then you're able to freeze them and package them. I like to keep several packages around just in case I want to have them with a steak or a baked potato or something. Pureeing fruit and putting it in ice cube trays allows you to be able to make smoothies easily and add them to recipes. For example, throwing some pureed plum in your muffin recipe instead of using a lot of extra oil. And then you can freeze eggs. And on the CFPA website and Facebook page, we have a whole feature about how to freeze eggs. And so now I'd like to go ahead and demonstrate another gadget that I think is a very useful one, especially if you're doing a lot of apples. I thought it might be fun today to share one of the really useful tools I've come across. Now, some of you may be familiar with this. It's a combination apple peeler, corer, and slicer. Now, these have been around for ages. I remember my grandmother had one that was attached to the edge of the big butcher block with a screw type of arrangement. This has one of these vacuum bases that really works well. So the whole idea of it is that you pull it back, you put the apple on, and then it cranks in. And we'll demonstrate that in a moment. But at the same time, it goes through and first it peels it, and then as it's pushing it through here and coring it, it's slicing it into nice spiral slices. This will also work for potatoes to make kind of a curly fry kind of potato. It helps to add a little water onto the vacuum base. This moves, so you can pull it back. And once you get started, you kind of have to keep it going. And what we're going to do is trim this up, and we need 5 cups of apple slices because we're going to make a couple of pints of apple pie filling for freezing that you can use to make apple pie at any time. So sometimes, because of different shapes of the apples, it requires a little bit of extra trimming, and sometimes when it starts it doesn't take the peel off as well, but that's okay because that makes snacks for later. Now, a lot of people will try to get the core off by pulling it back, and I've seen these blades bent that way, so I just like to use a fork. And so now I'm going to go get the apples that have been being held in a solution of lemon juice and water so that they would not brown, and we'll add these to it, and then we will cook ourselves up a couple of pints of apple pie filling for freezing for later. All right, so here are the 5 cups of apple slices that we made earlier and finished off just now. Don't worry, I've washed my hands so much today that... So they go in. Now, this is an induction burner. If you're not familiar with those and you find yourself needing what they call a 5th burner, an extra burner, I strongly recommend you look into induction burners. They work on magnetism, and so all the cookware you need have to have a lot of iron in it. And so most of these, they do stainless steel, which won't quite work. But down here in the bottom, in this layer, they put in a plate of iron. And so when the magnetism is turned on, it heats it. The thing that's really great about induction burners is they're instantaneous. Now, whatever heat's gone into it will stay, but if you've got a rolling boil and you need to stop it very quickly, you just turn it off and it will drop very quickly. It also heats up a lot faster. So I'm turning this on, medium heat. And so we're going to be using Pomonas Pectin, which works very well. And so rather than having to use an awful lot of sugar, the Pomonas Pectin sets up with calcium water. And it's a powder that we mix ahead of time with water. And we also put in a little bit of lemon juice, and this is the calcium water and the lemon juice. And then we bring that up to a boil. And we have cinnamon and nutmeg, and they go in at the beginning here so that the spices get a chance to meld with the cooking apples. And then we let it cook for about 3 or 4 minutes. When it's cooked and the apples have softened up a little bit and are heated all the way through, we're going to be adding the sugar, which is about 1/3 of what's used in other recipes. And we're also going to be adding the pectin. Now, pectin acts an awful lot like, if you're familiar with cornstarch, the way if you just throw it into water, it clumps up. Same thing will happen with the pectin. But if you take the amount of pectin you're going to use and mix it with whatever the sweetener is, and it can be sugar, it can be honey, it could be agave, it could be almost anything that you like, including artificial sweeteners. But for some reason, when you disperse the pectin molecules amongst the other molecules, they don't clot up. So we've got that nice and thoroughly mixed. Just to mention, if you hadn't seen the earlier video, the Pomonas Pectin comes in boxes. You can also order it in bulk by the pound. But it comes with the pectin, which is that beige, and then a white powder. And you mix a 1/2 teaspoon of the calcium water, or calcium with water, and you can store it in a refrigerator. As long as these things are well sealed in jars or something, you can keep the pectin and the calcium water almost forever. And every package comes with a recipe guide for adapting your recipes to using the Pomonas Pectin. So as I was mentioning earlier, we're in the beginning of May, and pretty soon we're going to be starting to see fresh farm produce. And so many people have taken up gardening during this time that there's going to be a lot of call for canning supplies and for doing some canning. And we're hoping that by June we'll be able to hold our classes again. But at this point, the only activity that the Center for Food Preservation Arts is being permitted to do is work in kitchens that are not being used for 24/7 like they usually are, and make the jams, jellies, and applesauces for food banks and feeding ministries. But instead of having 5 to 10 people working, the maximum we have is 3, so that we're pretty far apart. Well, once that is thoroughly heated, which it is, we go ahead and add the pectin sugar. I don't know if you can see this, but it's starting to gel up, and it's got a nice coating on it. And seeing it's starting to do what they call sheeting. It's starting to stick together the way you would with a jam, jelly. And I'm getting a face full of the cinnamon smell. Cinnamon and nutmeg. I don't know if I mentioned this in the last session, the earlier session, but one like this, one of these, and they have a really unique name. This canning ladle is named a canning ladle. But a number of years somebody sent me one, and it was, to me, very highly priced at that point. But it has definitely come down in price. And what I like about it is that it has pouring on all 3 areas, and it has its own hanger. But it's light, and it's basically was designed for canning. Now, if we were going to be canning this, we'd have a water bath canner, and you'd want to have headroom, space up on top, so that the air could come out of it. But we're going to be freezing these, so we're going to want to leave extra headroom. So while we might fill to about here, if we're water bath canning, we're going to fill it down to the shoulder of the jar so that there's plenty of room for expansion. Because there's nothing worse than putting in a lot of work, freezing something, going and opening it, and it's blown up. Now, if we were water bath canning, we would have to come really close to having the exact headroom. Since we're freezing this as long as it's below. So this would make, it's really close. Let's see, grab that one more little piece there. Oh yeah, that makes all the difference. But this, between these two, should be sufficient to make a regular size pie. And everything has been washed and sterilized ahead of time. And so we're just going to let it cool till it's about room temperature and then put it in the freezer. And so as I said, at the very end here, we'll post some links, like a direct link to our article on freezing eggs, a couple of other great articles that talk about all the different techniques for freezing things. And hopefully you'll visit our blog page and also our Facebook page where we post all different kinds of recipes, because we're going to have 4 different recipes that you can make with frozen apples. Applesauce, apple butter, apple pie jam, and then the apple pie filling. So thank you for joining, and hope to see you in a few weeks.